Hi, I'm Mary Keena. I'm the Livestock Environmental Management Specialist for North Dakota State University Extension, and I'm here to talk about using manure in your garden. How much and what kind? We're here to talk about using animal manures in your garden. So this is a popular practice, but there are a few nutrient differences in manure types and some other things that we should keep in mind if we're going to do that. So the objectives for today are to discuss the differences in fresh, aged, and composted manure sources, what kind of animal manure is best for the garden, and then compare and contrast the differences in manure from species to species. And so we'll mostly flow through the objectives in this order. However, I will have to jump kind of back and forth between these objectives just to make sure that we cover all the points. And so if I do lose you somewhere along the way, I have my contact info at the end of this presentation, and I'm happy to have you get a hold of me and clarify things. Okay, so first let's start with what I am not. I am not a horticulturist and I am not a soil scientist. And so I say those things because our state extension horticulturists and our state extension soil scientists got together in June of 2021 and actually updated the pub that you see here on the right, evaluating, preparing, and amending lawn and garden soil. And so today we're going to focus on manure. They go through in this publication all of the things of soil properties and characteristics and what you need to know about textures and water holding capacity and just different nutrients and minerals and such that the soil needs. And they also at the end of the publication do a here's a problem and here's a potential remedy step-by-step guide for both lawn and garden, so they're separate. And so if today, like I said, we're just going to talk about the manure part of things. I'm not going to talk to you about getting your soil ready and all the things that would go into that. Just manure is what we're going to talk about today. So I think before we go any farther, we have to talk about some manure terminology. And depending on who you talk to and when you talk to people, you'll hear different things and you'll probably hear some of the words off of this list here on the slide used, and you'll hear them used almost interchangeably. However, when I use them, each of these means something separate. And so if you're going to discuss manure with me, this is what I mean when I say these things. So fresh manure, when I think of fresh manure, I think of the manure that is out in the corral or has been deposited in the pasture. So fresh manure is the manure that the animals have left right out of their back end onto the ground. And so when we think of now we're in the winter and we are bedding because it is so cold in North Dakota right now, we're bedding our animals and they're depositing manure onto that bedding and urine, and there's also some feed stuff that's going to be on there, a little bit of hay, some skin cells. All of the things there together would be considered manure, and I consider that fresh. What stockpiled then means is we take that fresh manure and we push it up into a pile. So a stockpiled pile of manure goes through a heat cycle. But unlike its counterpart compost, which we'll talk about at the bottom of the list, it only goes through one heat cycle. So we push it up into a pile and it'll heat one time. Oftentimes it's stockpiled, one, to get it out of the way, two, to let it go through that heat cycle, three, because when we push it up, it allows our pens to dry. So typically livestock owners, if they have manure in a corral, will push it up in the spring and allow their pens then, their pen surfaces to dry throughout the summer. So that's stockpiled manure. Stockpiled manure, or fresh stockpiled manure, is often hot. It's what we would consider hot. And it's hot because it still has a lot of nitrate and ammonia nitrogen in it. So that's what makes it quote unquote hot. It's not, so the temp itself, if you stick your hand inside of a fresh stockpiled pile of manure, it will actually be temperature warm. However, when I say hot, I'm talking about the nutrients in there are going to be so much that they're going to burn. So that's the next one on the list. Then burn your plants. They're going to burn the leaves and the root system. It's just too much. So too much of a good thing is not a good thing. And so that's then where burning comes in. So we say it's too hot, it's going to burn our plants. Basically, it just means it's too rich for our plants. It's too much. Then we move on down the list to aged. So aged manure is manure that's been piled and it's been sitting for a period of time. Now there's not a specific period of time where we say this now changes from fresh to aged. However, more so it's in the nutrient content. And so oftentimes when our nitrogen volatilizes off, the nitrogen that I'm talking about in the forms of ammonia and nitrate nitrogen, when that volatilizes off, we oftentimes then call that aged manure. And so some folks will actually pile manure purposely in their corral area where their animals will overwinter. And they just pile it year after year after year, and they maintain a certain pile in their corral of aged manure, which then is considered a mound, and they'll bed that, and the animals can lay on that or lay behind it in instances where the wind is blowing from a certain direction. So that's oftentimes called aged manure. Aged manure is also considered cold manure. So unlike the counterpart hot from above, cold manure has very little or no ammonia or nitrate nitrogen in it. So that part that would burn your plants is no longer there. So it still has nitrogen in it. It's just a form that's not really available. And so that then the amount of that and the timing of that is all going to depend on things that we'll talk about later in this presentation. And then last on the list is compost. And so compost then, like I said earlier, is stockpiled manure, but compost is stockpiled manure that is then turned several times throughout the season. And so it's sitting there, it goes through a heat cycle, and then we turn it. And it heats again, and then we turn it, and it heats again. And so there's some other things that come into composting, but just the general gist of it is stockpile goes through one burn down cycle, and compost goes through several. What affects nutrient differences in manure? So differences in digestive systems is going to be one of the main things that's going to affect nutrient differences. Ruminants, like cattle or sheep, versus hindgut fermenters, like horses or rabbits, versus monogastric animals, like pigs, cats, or dogs. So the type of digestive system they have is going to determine the amount and availability of the nutrient that's going to be available for us when we're using it as a fertilizer. It's also going to determine the amount of weed seed breakdown that may or may not happen in that digestive system. So weed seed breakdown, when I talk about that, oftentimes the smaller the seed, the harder the seed coat, and the larger the seed, the softer the seed coat. Larger seeds with softer seed coats are oftentimes easier to break down or easier to destroy than smaller versus harder. And so when we talk about the differences in digestive systems, something like a hindgut fermenter or even a monogastric is going to have more weed seeds in it that are not broken down than a ruminant just because of the way the digestive system works. We also have to take into effect differences in diet, both within and among species. And so differences in diet, when I talk about this, so let's think about like a maintenance bull. So a bull, beef animal, that's at maintenance. He's gone through the breeding season. We have him back up to weight, and he's just hanging out. He's just overwintering. He's just eating hay, doing not much, versus a growing beef calf. And so we have them on two different diets. One is getting a lot of nitrogen, a lot of carbohydrate. We're really pushing the feed to them because they need a lot of energy to grow. So that calf does. Whereas the bull, he just needs to maintain his daily life. And so there's going to be a difference in the amount of nutrients we're putting in. Therefore, a difference in the amount of nutrients that's going to come out. And then I say within or among species. And so species, of course, are going to be different as well. Whether we have a racehorse would maybe be similar in energy levels to a lactating dairy cow. However, when we look at that maintenance beef bull, there's going to be a big difference in the diet that we're feeding all of them. And then physiological state as well. Is that animal pregnant? Is that animal growing? What was that animal doing when we fed it? Was it a maintenance horse or a racehorse? Was it a maintenance bull or was it a lactating cow? What did we have going there? So we're just going to address this before we go any further. Um, in case you've ever used manure in your garden and you want to come up and tell me, holy smokes, we used manure one time and we'll never use it again because of the weed seeds. So, does manure carry weed seeds? Yes. And I kind of just told you that from before with the way the digestive systems works. And even though a ruminant is more likely to break down a weed seed than a hindgut fermenter, there's still going to be weed seeds that pass through the rumen. However, does manure also carry nutrients that nourish the weed seed bank that's already in the soil? Also, yes. So chicken or the egg, which comes first? I'm well aware that manure carries weed seeds, but also sometimes we have a weed seed bank that is not nourished until we add something like manure, and then we see the sudden flush in weeds. Something that maybe we've never even fed to our animals, and all of a sudden there's different weeds growing. Well, let's take into consideration the fact that we probably had a weed seed bank there that was just waiting for the right nutrients to hit. One of those weeds, and one of the reasons we're here talking about weeds today, is something called Palmer amaranth. So Palmer amaranth is a pigweed. It's in the pigweed family. Very likely you've heard of redroot pigweed, something you've probably pulled out of your garden. And so this is part of the pigweed family. It's a summer annual. It's native to southwest US, and it's on the North Dakota noxious weed list, which is why I'm going to talk to you about it today. I think it's really important for you as gardeners to know whether you have a garden that's in your backyard, whether you're doing raised bed gardens, or whether you have 5 acres of garden. Either way, it's important for you to know that this weed is out there. So both Palmer amaranth, which I mentioned down in the lower right, but then also water hemp in the lower left. So they're all pigweeds, part of the pigweed family, but we're most common to knowing about redroot pigweed. The one that's behind the name you can't see is Powell amaranth, and then water hemp and Palmer. And the reason I'm bringing these ones up, especially water hemp and Palmer, is because of their ability to become resistant to chemical control and their ability to spread in tilled situations. Okay, so identifying these is kind of hard. As you can see on the previous slide, it was kind of hard to tell the difference between all of them unless you're a weed scientist, unless you're really down there with your weed book and you know what you're looking for. It just looks like a weed until you realize, until one accidentally grows on the edge of the garden, and then you have this weed that you don't know what it is. It's huge. It has so many weed seeds, and for you it might not be an issue, but if you leave it and it goes to seed and it seeds itself into your garden, you are going to have all kinds of weeds that you did not expect. So hairs or no hairs on the stems. So you can see here which ones have hairs and which ones don't. I'm not here to teach you about the weed seeds. I am, however, just here to make you aware of the fact that this is something that we're talking about a lot in the crop side of things and the livestock side of things. And I think as gardeners, it's important for you to know as well, because very likely you're bringing manure in from the livestock industry, which gathers feed from the cropping industry. So we collectively then have this issue of Palmer amaranth. Okay, so I went to Nebraska on a tour where we were able to go and see the effect that this has. Now, this is an agronomy field, so this is not a garden. This is actually out in a field. I looked at that little weed on the left, and then they talked about within days of application, this little weed was back. And the application that happened on the right, you can see that half the weed died, but half of it is still alive. And that's where the issue comes in. And if you let these weeds grow, I should have put a picture in here of how tall they can get. Like 7 feet tall, huge seed heads. They can become out of control in no time. And so what looks very small and innocent on the left is now partially resistant to whatever chemical control was used, and now is going to be even stronger in its next generation. Okay, so how does it spread and why is this important to us here? So bird feed. I feed the birds at home, and so don't think I'm picking on you. I have bird feeders all over my yard, and I like to listen to them in the morning, and I like to fill the feeders at night and wind down a little bit. And so I just want you to be aware that that is one way that potentially this weed can spread. Also though, manure and really anything that moves seed. So manure is one of the main things that we're here to talk about, so that's why I wanted to bring it up today. Okay, so if you think you found Palmer, if you're looking at this, and you can click on the links that I have here, I have hot links in this presentation, or you can contact me as well if you think, you know, last year I had a weed in my garden, I had no clue what it was, it looks suspiciously like this, I think we need to talk about it. Give me a call, or call your local extension agent, or call your county weed officer, and it would take some high quality pictures, or if it was last year and the picture season is over because we're in the tundra up here, look for it this year. Remember where it was, look for it, and then contact your extension agent or your county weed officer. They'll work with the North Dakota Department of Ag and extension specialists for confirmation. And if Palmer is confirmed, landowners should hand pull, bag on site, and destroy confirmed Palmer plants. And so there's a protocol that goes along with this. You're also going to want to make sure that you monitor the place where you found that weed. And so again, I don't say any of this to scare you. I just want you to know that it's a weed that could potentially be in your garden. And if you find it, these are the steps that you can take. You can also find more information at nd.gov/NDDA, so that's North Dakota Department of Ag /PA for Palmer amaranth. Okay, so does composting help this weed? Yes, but management is key. So if one seed survives being eaten by cattle and escapes the heat in composting and is spread onto a crop field, one seed can make up to 1 million seeds in a year. Now I know this is talking about a crop field and I know we're in a garden. Either way, most often it's a tilled situation, or it's a situation where we have more bare ground than cover ground. So it's not like we're out on a pasture where we would have a lot of grass growing. Oftentimes these plants thrive in situations like your garden. So the benefits of composting manure. So I said, yes, composting does help. So composting reduces weed seeds, reduces pathogens. Pathogens is a big one that we're worried about in the garden. It reduces nutrient loss, it increases nutrient stability, all things that are really good that we look for. And so especially on the pathogen side of things, and I'll talk later about the safety of manure and using it. And so that is something that we really want to think about when we're deciding if we're going to use manure or compost in our garden. We're not necessarily going to go through the steps of composting today. We do have an online workshop though about composting manure. It's something that NDSU Extension did with the University of Minnesota Extension and Sustainable Ag and Research Education, North Central SARE. And so we have this online course. You can find it at the hot link that's on this slide. And that goes through, there's 13 videos in there, and we go through all the things of composting. For today, I'm just going to hit on a few things that I think are really important. So this is a community compost project. I just wanted to show this to you because I think it's really neat. If you're looking for composting ideas, and on the previous slide you saw a couple bin systems there, this is probably more of a community system here, where basically it's just a big dumpster that has an auger that goes back and forth and up and down. And so what you see, the product in here is actually horse manure. And so this was horse manure that is composted, and it goes in one side, and it goes, the auger then goes back and forth, up and down, and as the compost is done, it moves down the composter until it comes out the other side, and then they're actually using that composted material as bedding for horses. And so it's horse manure that's then being used as, we call it, bedding reuse. And so, but of course, you can put it in the garden as well. So this is just one community idea in case you guys are looking for anything. Okay, so fresh manure versus composted manure. So we have fresh manure here on the left. You can see it's a little more clumpy. You can see some mushrooms growing in the foreground of the picture. So it's a good product. I like fresh manure and there are places for it. However, when you look at the compost that's been turned one time, only one time this was turned. So this is fresh manure turned one time, and we would turn it more than this. This was just the first turn, and I happened to go out and take this picture a couple years ago. You can already see the difference after one turn and what that product looks like. Which one would you want to put on your garden? Yeah, we really like that composted one over there. The particle size is broke down. It's very mixed. It's very uniform. That's why we like compost, because it's mixed together. Particle size is smaller. The uniformity is there. So that's why we like compost for a number of other reasons. So this is some screeners that then you would use for compost. You can either have one like that's on the right, where it would attach to a bobcat or a skid steer. It's smaller. You just scoop up the compost and then it goes through that screen system that you see on the upper right. Or there's bigger screeners, like a commercial type operation. And so this goes through and it actually takes the two big pieces are called the outs, and so they go into one side, and then there's the mids that are not the right size to go through the screen, and then there's stuff that's the right size to go through the screen that ends up in the pile that's complete. And so that's another advantage of using compost in the garden, is not only do you get a uniform product, oftentimes if you're buying it from a compost producer, it's going to be screened, and so you're going to have a really uniform, awesome product to work with. What is the nutrient analysis? So most manures have so much nitrogen in them, fresh manures, that they'll burn the roots of the plants. And so we talked about burning right away before we even started. And these are called hot. So remember, they're hot manures that'll potentially burn. Um, it says on here they must always be composted with carbon-rich materials. Always is a strong word, but if you're going to use manure and you're going to plant very soon after you apply the manure, I prefer you use compost, because then you're going to have a less likelihood of burning with a hot manure. Okay, so if you are going to use a hot manure and you're going to compost it, we're going to use carbon-rich materials like leaves and straw. Or if you're getting manure from a beef operation in North Dakota, typically we bed in the winter, and so we'll have a bedded pack is what that's called. Oftentimes that is actually the correct carbon and nitrogen ratio, so we'll just take that out of the pen and compost it. But we want to do that before it's applied to the soil. So our ideal carbon and nitrogen ratio is 20 to 40 parts carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. If the carbon is too high, if it's higher than this, the product is gonna use or borrow nitrogen from the soil, and it's actually gonna tie up nutrients that are available in the soil, making it less available for plant growth. And so that's why the carbon to nitrogen ratio is important, but also why I have highlighted before we apply it to the soil, because we want to make sure if we expect the nutrients there to be available, that we are managing the manure or the product that we're putting on the soil. So some approximate carbon and nitrogen ratios of selected manures are as follows here. So the first number is carbon, the second number is nitrogen. So you can see, like I said, cow manure is 25 to 1. And we want anywhere from 20 to 1 to 40 to 1 is our ideal. 20 to 1 or 25 to 1 is our cow. Now you'll see that sheep, I'm going to jump down to sheep because cows and sheep are both ruminants. And so I'm going to jump down there. You can see that they're 15 to 1. You might think, well, why is that? They have similar digestive systems, but they are able to, sheep are called what we would call sorters. So they're able to sort or pick through their feed a little bit easier. They use their lips to pick through their feed a little bit easier than a cow does. They're also smaller, have quicker passage, and so their digestive systems are just a little, you're going to get a little bit different nutrient content coming out of there. So a cow, and then actually a horse, 20 to 1. So horses are right on the edge of being good for that carbon to nitrogen ratio when we're thinking about do we have something that can readily be composted without adding anything else to it. Cow and horse manure is pretty good. Now when I talk about cow, I'm talking about actual like cow manure. Bedded pack situation where we're taking it from the cows that have been overwintered and then they calve, so even in the calving pen. I'm not talking about the backgrounding manure or a fresh manure from our finishing animals. They're fed a little differently. Now, if it's mixed with straw, and we have a bedded pack situation, then that's good. But if we're going to take the scrapings from right behind where we're feeding those animals, that's going to be what we would consider hodder manure. And so we're going to want to make sure we're careful with that. Sheep and swine manure, people and poultry. So you can see that as we go down the list, the carbon goes down, which means then the nitrogen goes up. So the hottest manures come from, like I said earlier, omnivores, chickens, pigs. They're also going to be a little more odorous than those with less nitrogen, and so you'll probably notice that. You can almost sometimes smell the ammonia coming off of the poultry litter, or you can just smell that it's a little smellier than a cow or a horse manure, even a sheep manure, and that's because of the available nitrogen that's there. So like I said, there is nitrogen in the stuff that is higher on the list, so cow, horse, sheep, but it is it's in a different form than it's in when we go farther down the list. And so they're a little cooler on top, a little hotter on the bottom. So then you can see here the second bullet, these cool manures tend to be crumbly with bits of grass still visible in them. And so again, think cow, horse, sheep when you think of that. So nutrient availability the first year is something else to keep in mind. When we're looking at nitrogen availability in fresh manure, so again, that's going to be our hodder manure, 50% of the nitrogen that's in the manure is going to be available the first year for fertilizer value. If we're composting that manure, only about 20% is going to be available. And so that's important because if you're using this to, if you're going to use manure or compost to build soil organic matter, you might think, well, I don't much care about what the nutrient availability is. However, if you're using this as a fertilizer and you think, well, I'll apply it as though it's 50% available, but it's actually composted and you don't have enough fertilizer there, you might be wondering what the heck halfway through the season. So I have that poultry, liquid, and swine manure should be tilled in quickly. So poultry manure, liquid manure, like if you're getting from a dairy or swine, and whether that dairy or swine is liquid or solid, they can be both. We do want to till them in quickly because of the amount of available nitrogen that there is in those. We don't want it to escape. If we're just going to let it escape, then we could just as well use a different kind of manure because we're basically wasting that money. So 6 to 8 inches deep, get it in right away. Phosphorus and potassium availability stay about 80 and 90% in both fresh and composted manure, and so more so we're really just worried about that nitrogen. Composted manure is best and safest. So I say this, and I want you to keep a couple things in mind. I do like fresh manure and aged manure. I do think it has its place, and we do use it a lot in the egg industry. However, when we're looking at your garden for reasons along with everything else that we've talked about. So for composted manure, we've talked about weed seed reduction, we've talked about uniformity, we've talked about nutrient stability, but also there's a food safety aspect. This is something that you're going to put in your garden, and then you're going to consume this food. You're likely going to consume it out in the garden, even though you should wash it first. And so we want to make sure that we can be as safe as possible when we're doing that. So one of the earlier slides about composting, I said that you can reduce the amount of pathogens, but also parasites that are potentially in that product. And so animals harbor pathogens that are potentially harmful to humans, and composting can mitigate this. So I want you to keep in mind that aged does not equal composted. So if you're saying, well, I'm going to go out, this guy has had manure that he's had on this pile for 24 years and I'm going to use it because it's composted. It is not composted, it is aged. Aged does not equal composted. So if we want to make sure that we're using the safest product possible, we're going to compost that manure. If you do use fresh or aged manure, look at going about 120 days out, so 4 months prior to planting. And if you're in North Dakota, then you're probably going to want to go ahead and put that on in the fall because in the spring, we just don't know when we're going to get to plant. Sometimes we're planting in April, sometimes we're planting in June, which means that in January, we'd probably have to be applying this manure. And well, it's January today, it's January 4th, 3rd, and it's cold out, you guys. It's like 0 degrees. -10 feels like. And so you're not going to be out there applying your manure. So if we're going to do aged or fresh manure, let's go ahead and put it on in the fall. And then let's avoid some of those root crops and other low to the ground produce that we would put in there. So something like carrots or potatoes or strawberries that are pretty low to the ground. Let's use composted manure for those. Here's some manure sampling information. You can click on the hot links. These are some labs that we use. This is a publication on the right that goes through step by step how to sample the manure. So you would send it in then for a nutrient analysis. Now, if you're going to incorporate manure into the garden, I know it said on here that I would tell you how much to use. And really, this is going to depend on a nutrient analysis and what you're using this manure for, or this compost for. Is it for nutrients and fertilizer? Is it for building soil organic matter? What are we doing with this compost or this manure? So a general rule of thumb and everything that I've been reading over and found is that 0.2 pounds of available nitrogen per 100 square feet is what's recommended. And so something else that we want to be careful about then is be careful of herbicide carryover. So herbicide carryover can be found in manure, can be found in wood chips and grass clippings. These are just a few of them. And so I list these ones because these tend to be some of the longer acting herbicides. And so they do a really good job. They do their job. But unfortunately, they also carry over into our garden, and sometimes they affect our plants as well. I put this Woods End lab down here, so woodsend.com. They test compost for herbicide carryover. So you can go to their website if you're curious about it. You can send them a sample. It does cost some money, and so that would be something. You can also test for herbicides yourself. And so what you can do in your manure or your compost is follow the instructions that are here, and you can, it's called a bioassay. So you'll be able to see then what's growing, what's not, what do you have coming out of your manure or your compost, and then you'll also be able to check for weed seeds when you're doing that, right? And so you'll plant you'll plant beans or peas, something that's pretty sensitive, and if they grow, you'll let them grow to 3 true leaves, and then you'll look and you'll measure them for what they look like. Are they normal? Does it look like something is wrong with them? And so that's a way then that we can tell without sending our manure in if we have a potential issue. Okay, so review then for this presentation. What is your goal? Is your goal to use manure or compost as a soil organic matter increaser, or is your goal to use it as a fertilizer? In a garden, composted is always safer for both food safety and for plant health, because if it's composted, it's likely cooler and we're not going to burn our plants up. Get a nutrient analysis. Send it in for nutrient analysis so you know what the heck you have. A mixture of types is best. And I say that because we saw the carbon to nitrogen differences in the cow versus poultry, right? That was the far range, 25 to 1, and was it 7 to 1? And so you can see then that there's a pretty big difference. There's going to be a difference in availability of what's there, and so sometimes mixing those products together is going to give you the best. You'll have a slow release product with the cow manure, and you'll have a little faster with the poultry litter, and so you'll have something then for all parts of the season, the growing season, as we go throughout. Keep an eye on what's growing in your garden and get help identifying it if it's something that you're thinking should not be there, like the Palmer amaranth that we talked about, and then watch for residues. And I put a little sad face here because sometimes this is one of the saddest calls I think our extension agents have to take is somebody calls and says, it looks like someone sprayed my garden. And then we end up looking at that and realizing that maybe it came from our compost. All right, here's a few resources. My name is Keena again. My contact info is here, and then there's just a few other resources and some that we talked about in the presentation today. Again, if you have questions, feel free to contact me. I hope you have a great 2022 gardening season.